Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. One of our favorite topics for you. Let's get right to it. Sailors of Reddit. What's the strangest or creepiest thing you've seen while at sea? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. During World War II, my dad, a wireless operator on a minesweeper, passed by a German pilot, waving frantically from his still floating aircraft in the North Atlantic. They were under strict orders not to stop because of the danger of subs, so they left the poor guy to certain death. My dad died a couple of years ago, but this incident haunted him throughout his life. He wept about it, even in his last few hours. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of the ocean, nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight. At the break of dawn, and there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the bottom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. Sailing around in the Arabian Gulf, you could look out and see flaming flares from all of the oil rigs. You get so used to the blackness when you're out to sea at night, and suddenly you see massive pillars of fire rising from the ocean all around you. Yep. When diving, a huge seiner net drifting towards you. It wasn't anchored or attached to anything, just a huge whirling cloud of death, full of barnacles and dolphin skeletons and decomposing fish. Once thought I saw a small landmass on the horizon. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be a dead whale, belly up, with seagulls standing on it pecking away at its flesh. I have family who sailed around the world. One day in the North Atlantic, their sailboat was going over some gigantic swells. They didn't have brakes at the top, so it was safe, but the boat was rising and falling way beyond the neutral. At the bottom of a trough, my uncle looked up to see the sun behind a wave and the silhouette of a whale inside, above him. We were once boarded out of Bahrain, and we woke up to this god-awful smell. I tossed on our coveralls and headed for the weather deck to find a cargo ship on the next dock, stacked 5 stories high, with cages of live lambs. Losing your ship's service generator in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean late at night. Most of the electrical service to the ship is lost until the emergency diesel generator hopefully starts up. When you're used to all the vibrations and sounds in your living spaces, silence is deafening. Yes, if you're used to loud, mechanical humming or whirring, but those sounds are more or less keeping you afloat, or fly, or alive, when they stop, it is deafening. So, glad you're okay. The sea is a vast and seemingly empty place. Many fail to grasp this when asking questions like, how can you just lose an airplane in the ocean? I found myself on my ship, somewhere in the vast expanses of the South Pacific Ocean. We had been cautiously avoiding big storms, which I knew to be all around us, out further than the eye can see. Although our local ocean area was calm and peaceful, I was on watch when I noticed something out there in the distance, bobbing along, that I had never seen before, especially this far from land. As I got closer, I definitely and defined what was clearly a makeshift raft, made from lashed-together bamboo, with a snapped mast and an empty cooler moored to the deck. Upon this raft was not a soul. The chances of coming across a raft to begin with are small enough in this part of the ocean. Thinking about the person or persons who once sailed that raft, why they sailed, and how they met their fate, that was what creeped me out. It was a foggy night off the shore of Long Island, and I was on a 75-foot schooner. The fog was so thick that you couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of you. The captain tells me there is no point to continue my watch at the bow of the ship, and him and I start talking at the stern. About that time, there is thunk on the side of the ship. We both turn to see a figure dressed in black, flowing robes walking towards us on the outside of the ship. The robes were scratching down the outside of the ship. It keeps coming closer and is high enough in the air that the top was about even with our heads. It turns out that it was just a black flag to mark a lobster pot. but for those first few seconds, it was terrifying, lol. Not me, but my father, back in his commercial fishing days, noticed that there was a t-shirt in the middle of his net after one tow. After a little investigation, he found that it was not a shirt, but a human torso wearing a shirt. He said he was terrified that he would open the net and a head would roll out onto his feet, but it didn't happen. His captain radioed ahead, and they brought the torso back to the docks, where they were met by the police and a coroner. They were eventually able to identify the body, based on clothing, as a victim of a plane crash that had occurred fairly recently. My dad said he offered a free lobster to the coroner, who graciously accepted it, until he found out that it had been found in the net with the body. After that, he got angry and told him to throw it back. Fishing out near the Great Barrier Reef, and my brother, who gets seasick, decides to go for a swim to settle his stomach, and less than a minute after getting back into the boat, a 17-foot great white went under the boat. Not a sailor, but I was on a fishing charter boat on Lake Erie. It was around 5 a.m., and the water was scary calm and glass-like, and it was so foggy you could not see more than 30 feet, if that. We all started hearing this plopping sound, like somebody was slapping the water with open hands. It kept getting louder and closer. At this point, we'd all slowly moved to the other side of the boat, not knowing what the F it was. Even the boat captain was standing there in total silence as we all just stood there and listened to this plopping sound getting closer and closer. And to the shock of us all, a deer swam by the boat. Yes, a deer. It looked to be a very large buck with at least 10 points on his rack. We were more than 10 miles offshore, so it made no sense at all. You could say freaky? The stars. When you're 3 days from the nearest land and it's a clear night, more stars than you could ever imagine, and enough shooting stars to make you run out of wishes. It was also pretty cool being stuck in the Panama Canal with a Los Angeles-class submarine when they had to shut down the locks. Before we knew what was going on, there were helicopters everywhere dropping off Marines to set up around the lock. California to Los Angeles. Toilets on boats are usually plumbed with seawater because it makes no sense to shit in your limited drinking water. One night I was taking the watch on a long-haul sail up the U.S. East Coast. We were rounding the Florida Keys, about to point toward Maine. I had to use the head, so I went below and pumped some water into the bowl. It was glowing in the dark. Freaked me out so much. Turns out there is photoluminescent phytoplankton in the water, which will glow if pumped into a dark toilet bowl. No longer scary. Actually pretty neat. Glow-in-the-dark toilet water. I'm sure there's probably a market for that somewhere on Amazon or Wish or, I don't know, somebody would want it. Heard this from a mate. Australian naval supply ship in the Great Southern Ocean, next to another naval ship. Swell was so great the top of one ship's mast was deck level to the supply ship. Another, told by a different mate, they were fishing off the shelf, off NSW. Boat big enough to hold 6 blokes. A shark longer than their boat swam past. They packed up and went home. Some things are too big and have too many teeth to fish near. Probably late to this, but whatever. I was working on a car carrier 4 years ago in the Middle East. Our typical route went through pirate waters at times, and so we always picked up 4 ex-Marines as security in Aqaba, Jordan, before we went. One night, while we were going through pirate waters off of Yemen, we started to have problems with the main engine. So we stopped and had to drift for a bit to figure out what the problem was. During this time, I was working on the stern, back end of the vessel. I couldn't really see anything out in the ocean. Everything was dimly lit on the ship. I don't know why, but I got bored and turned on the spotlight. And there he was. This guy with a gun in a rusted little boat, staring at me about 15 feet from the ship. I just stared back at him, kind of stunned. I was afraid if I reached for the radio to call one of the Marines, he'd shoot for the radio. He'd shoot me. The Marines had weapons. So he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he sort of gave me a nod as if he was telling me, "Well played." And I gave him one back. Then he slowly rowed his boat back off into the deep, pitch-black night. I didn't know how many others there were, but I did call it in on the radio as soon as I lost sight of him. I still remember his face today, that deep, stern, concentrated look. Hurricane Katrina. We followed it down to provide aid for what everyone knew was going to be a disaster. It was as if the world had split in two. Above us was this beautiful sky with a few clouds strewn about, and then, not far ahead, was this ghastly monster that engulfed up the rest of the sky. It was green and purple and black. The clouds twisted in a way I've never seen before, and the seas were very deceptive. If you looked at the water you were sailing on, the swells didn't look that intense, but I saw frigates and destroyers swallowed bow first and shot through the other side. I was lucky my ship was quite large. Even we were getting pelted on the O5 level of a supply ship, TAOE, and there were forget ever walking in a straight line. Most of the time you'd be walking on the deck one moment and then the bulkhead or wall the next. I've been in rough seas before on both smaller and larger platforms, but Katrina took the cake. It was just an event, one that I'm glad I was following and not intercepting. I was in the Navy standing watch and operations center. We were off the coast of San Diego. It was a very calm, clear night, very smooth water. It was just me and a buddy on watch. I stepped out on the port side of the bridge under the bright moonlight. As my eyes adjusted, I started to see a circle from the water and just grow and grow, making a perfect circle. I then noticed another and another. My mind tripped and could not figure out what was causing these massive circles forming near our ship. I went in and grabbed my buddy, went back out, and the circles were still forming. Being a big ship, we were pretty high off the water, and as we watched, I realized what was happening. Porpoises were chasing schools of fish up to the surface of the water, and the fish hit the surface. They started spreading out in perfect circles, and we'd see the porpoises break the surface in the middle and dive back down. It was an amazing sight at night. I seriously thought I was seeing some type of alien activity in the water for a minute there. The ocean at night is a beautiful and scary thing. Everyone should experience it at least once in their life. My uncle runs a charter fishing boat. He loves telling the story about how he was out in the ocean on his boat at night, and there was this beautiful woman floating in a raft unconscious. He and my cousin pulled her aboard, and she began to regain consciousness, and she was really drunk. Apparently, she ended up being on a party boat earlier, and everyone just thought she was being too annoying. So to get rid of her, they just put her on a raft and sent her off. Finally, somewhere I can tell this story, quite possibly the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life. It was about 2 a.m. in the middle of the Atlantic and very dark with no moon. As I was walking up to the bow of our sailboat to inspect the sails, I saw a faint glow in the water a long way off. I stared at the glow a long time before I realized there were actually two glowing objects, moving quickly underwater, on a collision course with our boat. Immediately I thought it was some submarine or torpedo about to ram our boat. But then the glowing shapes came right alongside the boat, perhaps a foot underwater. There were two ghostly blue dolphins, glowing brightly and so vivid and close in clear water. I immediately realized the dolphins were being illuminated by bioluminescent plankton, but the sight was surreal. I watched them play in the bow wave for a while, imagining sailors of the past, witnessing these eerie dolphin spirits, and how mind-blowing that must have been. I was sailing a small sunfish around an island near Florida in shallow water. As I cruised along, suddenly a large section of water directly in front of my bow exploded with a large splash. Immediately afterward, my boat rammed into something under the surface and came to a complete stop. My first thought was, I've hit a reef. But suddenly the entire boat was lifted up and spun around 90 degrees, almost dumping me into the water. Then there was another big splash, and I saw something zoom away, leaving a wake behind it. I was left freaked out and shaking. Then I thought to myself, I must have hit a big dolphin. Maybe it was a manatee? Lots of dolphins around here. So I finished my sail and went home. When I got to the beach, I pulled up to the centerboard and found a real surprise. A 2-inch chunk had been bitten out of the wood. You could clearly see the marks of 3 large teeth. I'm very happy that I didn't fall out of the boat that day. All right, maritime experts, what do you think basically lifted that boat out of the water and turned it 90 degrees? Must be big. When I was 19, I had just gone to sea for the first time with the U.S. Navy. A few days after heading to the Gulf of Mexico for a few weeks of drug ops, we were dispatched to the Straits of Florida because Fidel Castro had opened the doors and people were fleeing Cuba in droves. It was called Operation Able Vigil. One night, after standing watch all day over dozens of people who'd been pulled out of the water, I was standing on the O3 level of the ship with the chief, smoking a cigarette. It was the only exterior surface of the ship not covered with refugees. It was a full bright moon that you could see reflecting on the ocean's surface, and we were talking about how crazy this all was, and looking at all the other Navy and Coast Guard ships on the horizon, doing slow circles looking for people like we were. Suddenly, in the reflection of the moon, we both saw something pass through the reflection. He looked at me and I nodded that yes, I too had seen something. He took off like a shot to the bridge, and ship started to circle back toward the thing we'd seen. It was a person in a life preserver just floating in the middle of the Straits of Florida, hoping someone would see him. There were on this $2 billion missile-loaded warship doing slow circles, looking for people in the water. All told, my ship saved and/or transported 1,800 people back to Gitmo for processing. Keeping in mind, ship's crew were only about 400 people. It left a big impression on 19-year-old me.